It was you. You were luck. Thank you.
All right, great. Ready? All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. It's time to continue our program. I hope you had a wonderful break. Pardon us for the less than usual, style of casual lunch, but at least I hope that everybody get some energy. And we are very fortunate to have Professor Sarah Williams from MIT to be our next keynote speaker. Professor Williams is currently Associate Professor of Urban Planning and the Director of the Civic Data Design Lab at MIT. Under her leadership, the Civic Data Design Lab works on data maps and mobile technology to develop interactive design and communication strategies that bring urban policy issues to broader audiences. And she's trained as a geographer, also a landscape architect and urban planner at MIT. And her work combines geographic analysis and design. You should see her exhibit in the MIT museum. That's under in the hall, in the center of the museum hall. Really, if any of you have time to visit, it's a must-see. And before coming to MIT, Professor Williams was co-director of the Spatial Information Design Lab at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. And she has won numerous awards, being named one of the top 25 planners in the technology and 2012 Game Changer by Metropolis Magazine. So with that, Professor Williams.
Oh, great, thank you. Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Good. Perfect. First of all, I want to thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this group today. It's a pleasure to be here and talk a bit about my work. One of the things that we hear all the time is that the rise of big data is going to change the world that we live in. And I believe big data will not change the world unless it's collected and synthesized into tools that have a public benefit. My research lab, the Civic Data Design Lab, attempts to take data, something that looks like this, which you guys should all be familiar with as GIS, spatial analytics, and transform it into images that can have a compelling policy effect. And I always show this when I introduce a lecture about myself because it really helps to frame the research that we do in the lab. So this map actually shows the cost of incarceration in Brooklyn, New York. These very red dots, it shows where over $1 million was spent to incarcerate people from these blocks, and we call these $1 million blocks. If we zoom into that neighborhood in Brownsville, these 17 blocks, it costs over $17 million to incarcerate people from these blocks. And the idea is to create visualizations that allow people to think about possible other policy strategies for these neighborhoods. And for a lot of reasons, the systemic issues of incarceration has to do with the fact that there are limited education programs, limited job training programs, limited health services for people in these communities. And the idea is if we could spend just $1 million on these types of programmings, could we change the policy situation in these nature and change the systemic issues in these neighborhoods? These maps were exhibited in the Museum of Modern Art, and you can see them here. And in fact, if you go to the museum right now, they're on the 4th floor. They're part of the permanent collection. And actually, a congressman saw these on the museum walls and asked if he could use them in his presentation for the Criminal Justice Reinvestment Act of 2010. And this this piece of policy allocated $25 million to reentry programming, which is meant to alleviate some of the problems with people returning home from prison and then re-entering prison system because they don't have the proper skills to reintegrate into society. So, well, I show this project because it's kind of one of the longer term projects that we have in the lab, and really kind of explains what we're trying to do by visualizing data and really hoping to create change. So one of the things that I've become really interested as I've done this work is that about 80% of the data in the world is privately owned. And I'm really interested in how we can get access to that data for a public good. And I really want to use it to unlock policy change. So I kind of created this ethic in the lab. This is kind of how my students think about things, is how we can build it, hack it, share it. And what do I mean by that? I think that we have mobile devices, and everyone has access to mobile devices. It's really easy to collect and build your own data collection tools, cheap, easy. And how can we do that outside of governments when they're not actually collecting that data, or even in communities that need certain kinds of data sets? We can actually build those data sets to create our own policy change. 2, there are so many websites that are collecting data from us, either passively or intentionally. We are giving our data away. How can we access that data and harness it and scrape it from websites to build our own policy change? Finally, I think, if we build a data set, you hack a data set, sharing data is one of the most important ways that we can create policy change from some of the geographic analysis that we do. And I think that's for a number of reasons, but most importantly because it helps us build partnerships with both stakeholders in the community, the tech community, but also governments to share more data with us to make better decisions as we go through. And so it also creates a sense of trust as we are planners. We want community and government trust. So what I thought I'd do is show a few projects from my lab that I feel like fit each one of these examples so you can get a better idea of what I'm talking about. So build it. We all know that we can collect our own data sets, and so some of you might be familiar with this project that I worked on in Nairobi. How many of you are familiar with it? 1. Okay, so 2. So actually, I'll go into a little bit more detail then. So Nairobi suffers from severe congestion problems, and this is a problem not just in Nairobi, but from many rapidly developing cities suffer from severe congestion problems. And I've been working in Nairobi for some time. I've developed their first GIS data model in order to create a transportation model for the city, and this is image. If you look at the data in Google Maps from Nairobi, it comes from the data that we created for this model because there wasn't any GIS data, and we created some land use data. But one of the biggest issues when I developed this model for Nairobi is I didn't have information on the matatus. And these are these small buses that you see in this image. They are the main form of public transport, and they represent the majority of the cars on the roadway. And it was almost essential that I have this to understand and model the transportation flow.
They're painted in hot designs, and their name Matatu is derived from the Kiswahili words for 3 cents for a ride, which nowadays is more like 30 cents. The fares are raised by the conductors. Traveling by Matatu is a daily reality for millions of Kenyans. It even became a trademark for this East African country.
So as you can see, matatus are everywhere in the city, but also They have painted designs. People are very attached to their matatu. They're very much like the subway system. You know, when we talk about the subway system here, the most common conversation in Nairobi is, what happened on your matatu this morning? Which one did you drive? There's a Jay-Z matatu. If anybody is familiar with the Sense8 program, there's a matatu driver that's actually in Sense8. But I was really interested in how can we get raw data for our model, but then actually provide data for everyone to use. So what was interesting is when I went to City Hall to find out where these matatus went, there was no record. You register your matatu, you register the route, but it really just says to and from. It doesn't say the route that it actually goes on. And I realized not only was this a problem for me in my model, but it was also a problem for those people and citizens in Nairobi who want to get around and make better decisions about their transport options. So I thought, how can we leverage the ubiquitous nature of cell phone use in Nairobi, Kenya, to capture data about the informal transit system, which most citizens depend upon, and open that data up for anyone to build upon? We developed an app, a cell phone app, with the University in Nairobi, and I want to say that we did this with the university so that the technology would stay there. It was built by computer science department students. They went out and measured the data, and they measured the data in a format called GTFS. How many people are familiar with GTFS? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe. That's like the best room, other than a transport crowd. I think I just got the best statistics on who knows GTFS. So GTFS, you probably have all used GTFS today. When you navigate in Google Maps to find your transit option, GTFS is the underlying data structure. We use GTFS because there's tons of open source products that already use this, so you don't necessarily have to use Google Maps and GTFS. Actually, there's a lot of routing packages that you can download from GitHub to do routing software. And GTFS is essentially a text file that has information on the route ID, the latitude and longitude, the name of the stop, and the stop times. It's really a schedule-based file format. You can see here as we were bringing the data in, it begins to bring up the roadways of Nairobi. But one of the issues that we had as we were doing this project is trying to figure out how to create a visual that anybody would understand. So we had our data for our model. And you know, we created it in a format that our model could understand. But how could we make this complex system understandable to anybody in Nairobi? And we kind of split the data up into different routes and gave them colors. But ultimately what we did is we designed a map that looks much the same as a subway map that you might see London, Paris, New York, Boston, as an example. And we did that using a kind of local knowledge. One of the ways that people in Nairobi get around is they move through landmarks. So you wouldn't necessarily have an address, but you would actually have a stop that you go to, and each one of the stops in the map represents an so we can hear. So one of the things that we did is we worked with the matatu drivers to check and verify and kind of ground truth our map. And one of the things that you see that's happening right here is they're actually noticing that there's no matatu routes in the north of the city, and they're actually beginning to plan those routes. And so one of the things that I think is really important about this process is that you could create a map with local knowledge, but you can really create a visualization that helps be used as a planning tool. And here, the matatu drivers are really the planners of this transportation system in Nairobi. Here's us editing the map with some of the government officials. And ultimately, we were super excited that the government made this the official Matatu map of the city. And I think many reasons for that. One of them is because we included them in the process. They were invited to come to the data collection. They trusted the data just as much as the Matatu drivers trusted the data because they were included in the process, as much as the local tech community believed in the data because they were included in the process. So one of the things that I like to talk about with this project is that really by being inclusive, whether people actually engage in that process, but being inclusive in a data collection project really helps create a lot more change because everyone can trust the data set. The maps went viral on the internet, and actually just last week I got a query from a major t-shirt company. They're going to make t-shirts out of it. But one of the things that I like to talk about is how do you measure success in an open data project? Because once we created this data, we opened it up for anyone to use through the visualization, but also through the data itself. And I think that's when others leveraged your data to generate their own policy change. So, you know, we were really excited when we were invited by the Nairobi government to a press conference where they made it the official map of the city. So they're creating their own policy change by developing this map. They were able to have a conversation about the Matatu system. And really one of the biggest issues in Nairobi for the government was actually getting external funding for the system because it seemed too chaotic, too messy, not like it was one system. So when they're applying for funding through different NGOs and different resource centers, it was really hard to leverage and get that funding. Now it looked as though it was one system that could be planned on. It really helped the government generate funds for change. The local technology community, there are now 5 different apps, private-based apps that use this data as their underlying data set. There's routing apps. There's a Waze-like app that helps tell you where crashes are and so forth. And then this is one of the things that I really enjoy is I was at the World Bank and I saw this map. Doesn't it look very similar to my map? It's hard to tell the difference, isn't it? This is actually the map of the BRT system that the World Bank has planned. And what they're doing here is really trying to leverage the popularity of the informal bus map to generate the routes for the bus rapid transit system. How many people know what bus rapid transit is? Everyone? One? Bus rapid transit is when you have a dedicated line for a dedicated aisle for buses, right? So that means the bus can only go in that dedicated lane. And so one of the things that would be really helpful in Nairobi's congested traffic if there was a dedicated lane for some of these buses. And so they're using this map to garner support and funding for that. Not only has this happened in Nairobi, but a lot of people have copied this project, which we're excited about. Amman used our same tool to collect their system, Managua, and now there's we have a network of over 20 different cities that have followed this process. Google has put it into Google Maps, so it's the first informal transit system available and searchable in Google because we created this GTFS system. And one of the things that I think is important if we go back to the transportation is when people were making decisions about their transit, originally you would go into the city, ask a Matatu driver how to get to this location, and then you would come back out because you knew that all the buses came in and out. This is now giving people options and understanding that there's cross buses. And not many people we're familiar with some of these buses that go across the city instead of going into the city center. And one of the biggest issues in transportation problems is this kind of everybody coming into the center and then going back out. So semi-formal transit provides mobility around the world. And this work is happening in Nairobi, but can happen in anywhere that these kinds of systems exist. And we're working on several conferences to help bring this data to light. Another project that I'm just going to mention really briefly in the Build It category is a project that I released just last week. So we don't have a lot of data analytics on it yet, but I thought it would be really interesting to measure or talk about. And Benchmark is a project in measuring tactical urbanism. And tactical urbanism has been a really hot topic lately. It's this idea of creating places out of things that we wouldn't normally think of as a place to get people interested in design of their community and thinking about new strategies for public space in their communities. And we've never really had a way to measure how effective this is. So we've actually developed a bench, which is a sensor toolkit, which actually measures how people use a placemaking device. So how long do they like to sit on it? Where do they move the benches to? Do they like sun or shade? How do they engage in these different benches? And how do they create good urban spaces? So the benches collect data on whether somebody sits on it, how it moves, light and shade, and so forth. This is actually us putting the bench together. It also has a light feature. And this was just last Friday, us putting these out into the lawn at MIT. And you can see people using the benches for sitting at lunch. But they also have a lighting display, which is responsive at night. So if the more lit they are, it's the more people liked sitting on them during the day. So you can see these poor lonely benches over here no one really sat on, and these ones are popular and people are sitting on them now. So we've kind of combined the idea of measuring data but actually showing the data in the space that it is. And so ultimately, I hope to be able to talk to you guys about these projects and the analysis from it in a few weeks as we process all the data. But we have information in a grid about how long people sit and where, how do they cluster in space, what kinds of environmental conditions do they prefer, and we've started to generate some maps. This is just an animation of the benches in one day, and you can see that we're dealing with some GPS shifting and kind of averaging for that. We're actually adding accelerometer data to this to get a more precise data set. And hopefully what we can do is create the William White study of urban places updated for time. And so hopefully I can come back and tell you more about the analysis of this project. So the second thing that I said in my presentation was build it, hack it. So I'm going to talk about hacking it. And so we want to hack data and take it from the crowd and really harness data from social media. And I decided that I would work on a project in China around this phenomenon called ghost cities. How many people have heard of ghost cities? Almost everybody. That's amazing. That's really great. And so, you know, one of the biggest questions with this phenomenon, here you're looking at one that we took with a drone flight, is really you know, how large or extensive is this problem? And I think that one of the things that you can really say about ghost cities, if you were to able to map it, is that it would show the extent of risk in the Chinese real estate market. And since many of you are familiar with ghost cities, you might be familiar also with kind of the financing that goes behind it. But you know, ghost cities are developed because the government opens up land to be developed. They encourage development on that land. Oftentimes, no one moves to these locations either because of they don't have the proper jobs or amenities associated with it. Yet the government needs these land to be purchased, so they open up new land to be developed upon so that the developers can pay back the loans for the old land, and it creates kind of a cycle where these types of developments continue to happen to feed the real estate market in China. The complexity of the real estate market is that the banks and the government are kind of one and the same. So it's really to the government's benefit to continue to do this loan cycle in the way to make sure that the economy stays afloat. And so what winds up happening is that there's these large cities, but in the case of my study, smaller developments that lie vacant or underutilized. And I was really interested is if I could make a map of where these are, we could really determine risk in the Chinese real estate market. And I thought this data is really hard to come by. How can I scrape data from social media sites in China to try to get information on that? So I actually hacked into Chinese Yelp, Chinese MapQuest, Chinese Zillow, Chinese Google or Baidu Maps, Chinese Facebook. We even hacked into Chinese Twitter, which is really insecure. So anybody who's on Chinese version of Twitter, your data is completely exposed. But and also Facebook. We did this for 22 different cities, and we developed a model that's based on the idea that if access to amenities is essential to thriving communities, you can determine whether or not a residential location is active. So that the idea is that in order to be an active residential community, we have to have a grocery store, place to eat, place to get our hair cut, things to do. And so what we did is we scraped all of the residential points of interest from AMAP, which is the Chinese MapQuest, and Baidu in order to get a complete data set. And in fact, Chinese MapQuest had more residential points of interest if you're interested in that. We then created a grid. Each grid represents a residential location. So if you have a point of interest in that grid, then you're a residential location. Then we created an amenity score based on the idea that access to amenities is essential for these residential locations. And we looked at both distance and opportunity to access those amenities. We did it through a centroid calculation. So if we used actually Dianping amenities with also their reviews. So Dianping is the Chinese version of Yelp. We found that it was more complete points of interest data about amenities than the Baidu and AMAP, and it also gave us kind of an information about how much people like to go to that place by looking at the reviews. So here we have a amenity score of 8.4, and once we created, and just, you know, I know that we're doing distance as the crow flies. We decided to do that because we didn't have a good roads network data set. If we do have a better roads network data set, we would include that information and do distance as driving distances instead of Euclidean distance. We created an amenity score. Then we actually clustered those different scores that had high amenity scores, and we called those our ghost cities development. We did this for 3 test cities so far: Chengdu, Tianjin, Xi'an, and we went and actually ground truthed these data sets. And so some of the things that we found is some of the developments were maybe developed in the last 5 years and may ultimately get populated in another 5 years. So this is an example of some of those developments. We also found a lot of stalled developments. So these are most likely developments that are meant to happen but then didn't ultimately get built, and often surrounded by vacant or semi-vacant housing or residential locations. We also found abandoned communist housing or housing that's much older. And you can see these towers are completely empty. No one lives there anymore. Probably they're going to be either torn down or redeveloped. And then we found some larger cities like this one, which are completely, have not been occupied or developers. So one of the things that we're really interested in the lab is not just kind of creating a model, but actually ground truthing our model. So you can see that we went to them, but then actually talking about the results with Chinese academics, developers, and planners so that we can understand how this work and these maps can help benefit their work. And so I think, you know, in the situation that was very different from Nairobi, in that, let's say that the academics were super interested in understanding these maps and really identifying these risks and talking about development and real estate strategies. The developers really were really interesting because, you know, in many ways it helps them figure out where they don't want to develop. So they could use these maps as a tool to figure out where to not put increased investment. But I think for many of the developers, they're benefiting from this financial scheme. And so knowing these risky areas is not as important to them because they're actually continuing to get money from the government. What was really interesting to us is some of the local planning agencies were actually a lot more interested in the data than we thought because they're not actually getting this information directly from the government. So where the higher levels of government might have access to this information, some of the local planners do not have access to it, or even some regional planners that are looking at those different areas. However, ultimately, I think in a situation like China, a lot of people were wary about the data, what it could do, how the government could have ramifications on them if they were to use and support these data sets. So it's an interesting story, and as we share this data, we hope to create different kinds of awareness around policy in China. So the last thing that I want to talk about is sharing data sets, and sharing data really builds partnerships and allows us to have a commitment to a project. And one of the projects that was really useful for us in the lab that used a shared data set was a project called City Digits. And City Digits is a project we developed to teach data visualization and also math skills to youth in Brooklyn using an openly available data set. And that openly available data set was the lottery. And if you can believe it or not, the New York State lottery system has data about winning in sales for everywhere in New York State. And I called them and asked them for their data set, and they happily gave me every bodega in New York City, how much people win and how much people lose, or how much people buy lottery tickets, how much people lose lottery tickets. And we decided that this was a great data set to teach youth about probability and odds using the place that they lived in. And so we mapped this data, and you can actually find this curriculum on citydigits.mit.edu. And here you're seeing the green shows all of the areas, shows how much was sold in a particular location, and the purple shows you how much people win in that same bodega. So one of the first things that the students learn, can't find my words this morning or this afternoon. But one of the first things that students learn is that the odds are always off, right? And that the odds are always against you when you're playing the lottery. The City Digits Local Lotto is a curriculum. It teaches them exactly that, how to create a probability model and odds, and then they go towards the map. It was given to the youth on iPads. And one of the things that we were really interested in doing in this project is not just taking an open data set, but allowing the youth to create a qualitative data set to go along with some of the quantitative data analytics that they had. So students actually were able to use the tool to ask people what they thought the lottery, did they think it was good or bad to their neighborhood. This is actually them, the data, these devices actually would take a picture and a recording. That recording went directly onto the website in which the tool was used, and then it was included into a map. And then students used the maps and data to talk about what their opinion was on the lottery. So this group of students thought the lottery was a scam. The students also made their own maps from the data set. This one is looking at how much % of income is spent on your lottery tickets. And one of the things that I think is really interesting when we're using open data, but we're using open data with youth, is teaching data literacy. And so by the end of the project, students were able to make arguments with the data both through quantitative and qualitative means. And I think data literacy is one of the most important things that we need to teach people who are using open data sets. Many novice people are using open data and they're not using it properly. And so how can we teach youth and also the average novice geographer to use data ethically and responsibly? The final project that I want to show today is a recent project that we use a lot of open source data, but we also use a lot of data that we scraped off of the web, and it kind of combines many of the different topics I talked to you about today, is the Atlas of Lighting. The Atlas of Lighting is a project that was funded by Philips Lighting because they were really interested in how light affects the economy of cities. And one of the things that's discussed a lot is the presence of light has this relationship with cities. And so we developed a tool that actually took night lights data sets and combined it with 22 different other openly available data sets or data that we scraped off the web. Here we did it for 5 different cities. Here we're looking at Chicago, and what we did is actually split each one of these cities into a grid. We're looking at Chicago, highlighting and development intensity, and one of the ideas is really using this tool to identify areas for Philips in which they can intervene in lighting strategies, but I think more internally for the lab, it was using a tool that combined all of these different various data sets to describe the cities that we live in. So one of the things that we did as part of this project is, we found many of the low-income areas have more light than the high-income areas. And this can be seen as you use the tool itself. This video, is it showing? The video is not showing. I'll just skip to the next slide. So low-income areas have more light than middle-income areas or high-income areas, and that's for a lot of different reasons. It's for some of the lighting in this area uses poor lighting structures, and what I mean is a lot of cities have replaced their lights with less bright LEDs to make them more comfortable at night, but also it has to do with density of lower income areas as well. But also the types of infrastructure that exist in those areas. Many low light areas have lots of parking lots and other kinds of highways. And so the idea is that Philips can actually intervene in those areas to have better lighting structures, but it also can be used as a tool for cities to think about how to deal with light noise in those particular areas. Some other things that came out of this study is that vibrant business areas associated with high lighting. And so, we could look at the business densities, and the way that we actually did that is we scraped all of the business data from Google Maps, and we're actually looking at business points of interest. So again, this is taking data set that is not typically available to everyone and get a very detailed analysis of the businesses and where they exist and their relationship with light. We could also even look at the types of businesses because each one of those Google businesses were tagged. So here we're looking at a nightclub and its relationship with light. These nightclubs have high lighting, as you can see here. And one of the things that we did is that once you look at each cell, we incorporated a Google Maps data, but then we also filtered in and brought in Instagram data and Twitter data at those locations so you could begin to analyze what's going on. And so this is, again, bringing the qualitative data and the quantitative data together to help us get an impression of the place, to think about what are some of the urban interventions in terms of planners can take action upon. One of the other data sets that we got is because we scraped the Google data, we could actually get the hours that different businesses are open. So now we're looking at all of the businesses that are open from midnight to 3 o'clock in the morning, and what kinds of businesses they are. And then we can look at that in relationship to household income, and look at those areas that have low income and also are open in the morning and have high amounts of light. And so really what we're hoping that this tool can be used for is we're less interested in Philips' interest in light, but how cities can use it to understand when places are open and closed, the active spaces, what's happening in communities, and how they can think about creating better plans and really using this as a planning tool. I'm going to skip through this a little bit. I think one of the things that was really fun about this project is we downloaded all of the Instagram data for all of these grid cells. We could begin to look at where there's high, and we were using Instagram to show social activity and look at different content or topics. And so we ran all of the images through a machine learning algorithm to figure out the topics. And so if we're looking at these different Instagram grid cells, these are the topics that are included in them. And then you can see the topics that are associated with different levels of light, which was something that was interesting to Philips. So the Atlas of Lighting not only allows you to understand the regional relationships with light, but it also allows you to make relationships between lighting and socioeconomics. But I think what's more interesting about this topic for this group of people here is really what's under the hood, more so than the tool itself. So, one of the things that this project involved was really creating a number of different scripts that allowed us to create this grid structure and then pull all of this data into these very small grids to try to account for population, to try to account for lighting, to also average different kinds of both openly available data set from census data, but data sets that we got from Instagram, and so forth. And so there are a lot of back-end scripts that are being developed to create this grid and interface structure. But the other thing that we used is machine learning and vision recognition on the Instagram images themselves. We took over 670,000 images. We categorized them using machine learning algorithms. So you can see on one side, this is something that's a cityscape versus portraits. We would take an image such as this one, run it through, sorry about that. Why is sorry. Oh, on my screen there's something that you guys are not seeing, which is good. You know, we would take an image like this one that came through Instagram, run it through our algorithm. It would be tagged as a structure, a stadium, a geographic feature, a sports venue, a soccer, a stadium. Then we created, through these tags, these main types of activities: advertising, beverage, car, entertainment, food, interiors, and landscape. And so these Instagram topics come together, and we are able to actually filter out all of the entertainment Instagram. This is actually looking at those in Los Angeles. And so this is really an attempt to try to think about the value you can create with Instagram photos. That are kind of messy, crowdsourced data set. Can we actually use machine learning to understand them better? So hopefully I showed you some ways that you can unlock data for policy change, and I hope that all of you think about ways that you can build it, hack it, share it to generate urban change. The Civic Data Design Lab has a lot of other projects, and I really encourage you to go to our website and check out some of the other projects that are going on in the lab right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I was looking at all these different projects that you're doing, and I was wondering, some sort of this neighborhood or civic citizen-based type projects, how often in your experience do these live kind of beyond you, that kind of live beyond the period of the, say, the funded area and sort of take on a life of their own? I think the Nairobi was a good example of that.
Yeah. I would hope that they all take on a life of their own. That's the idea. And I think one of my main methods is really to create partnerships on the onset of the data processing project, right? So in the case of Nairobi, you could see we had policy experts, we had the local community, the government, and our analytics team working together so that they can build their own change later. That also happened in the City Digits project. The school is now using this in a lot of, we piloted it in Bushwick because they worked together on the data and we created the curriculum together. Now it's going to a lot of different schools. Let's see, the other project that I worked on, the Atlas of Life is now something that's a tool that some of these cities have picked up and have left kind of the Phillips foray and are moving more into city analytics. But I really hope that this inclusive process of including the various different stakeholders in the data analytics process from the onset helps each one of those groups feel empowered to take it on and change it in a new way. I would love it to happen in the Ghost Cities project. I think, let's say, the kind of ability for, let's say, on-the-ground activism that you might see in a place like Nairobi is very different than it is in China. And I think some of them are very wary of using the tool for government pushback and other kinds of issues that we might see in speaking out about the government.
Yeah, first of all, great project. I think one of my questions is in your project, you utilize several social media data, like Twitter, Instagram. But the ownership of the data is very restricted and limited. Like I saw you using machine learning, analyze Instagram data, but in your policy, actually you need to get permission from Instagram to apply the machine learning. How do you deal with those privacy, ownership, and then deal with the private company?
Right, so with the Instagram data set, we did ask for permission, and because we're presenting them in an aggregated format, we were allowed to do the work. But and in some of the projects that I worked on with Facebook, same goes. So I will say that I get the data first and then ask for permission later. I will say that's my process. And it has worked out well for me because often then they can see what the final output would be, and then they can understand whether it's going to be good and bad for their company. And so that has worked better for me than asking first. It's not totally legal to do that that way, but I think mostly, I guess, in terms of legal, they don't want anything published without their authorization. So we have the data, we're using it. I don't publish something until I've discussed it with them. And many times they're excited to see the use cases. I think that they're interested in having use cases that show how this data can have a benefit to public. In the case of the China data sets that we did contact them, and nobody actually responded to us. There was some strange things like, for example, like the Chinese version of Twitter, like they have information on their website about getting the API key, and they put an API key in that demo, and we just used that API key, which had an unlimited, like, it was, I don't think that they realized that they put their internal API key on the web, and then we were able to get all the data, and then we like called them and explained that to them, and we didn't get there wasn't a lot of as much contact as we were able to have with some of the other. And I did have one of my students that's from Shenzhen do a lot of the communication with these different social media organizations so that could happen within the Chinese language, so that there wasn't a lack of translation there.
Ghost City is really interesting, not just for the ghost, but it seems like you'd have information on sort of the level of activity, above ghost, maybe zombie level or something.
We have everything from zombie to dormant.
Yeah. Did you look at sort of more active levels than ghost, to look at different levels of sort of activity or services?
Yeah, I mean, I call the project Ghost Cities, but I would say that like actually what I'm getting is kind of more areas where people do not live but are meant to be livable, right? And so I think ultimately what it's really showing is a range of really poor quality housing that needs to be redeveloped, or high quality housing that people didn't move to because they probably didn't have the services built associated with it. A lot of these ghost cities, what I found through my ground truthing and talking to planners is, they may be great developments, but they never planned a school. And so there's no school for the children, so people don't want to move there because there's no school nearby. So there's a lot of these ghost cities could be changed with some small planning decisions. And that's where the local planners were more interested in using the data sets to understand what was the reason that people were not moving to these places. And I mean, it seems surprising that you wouldn't put a school in a development, but it happens as these things are just rapidly pacing.
I could imagine the methodology you developed for the Ghost Cities project as being replicable with some tweaks to many other cities around the world, many other regions, countries, urban areas. Have you had interest from, say, government entities, from from other countries that were interested in getting, say, consulting on how you might apply it to another place? Because it strikes me as an incredibly efficient, cost-effective way to get a whole bunch of information that wouldn't necessarily have already been gathered by the government, which could be used by the government for good purposes.
Well, these articles are just coming out, so hopefully I would love to work with other cities. I think it's particularly good for cities where there's a limited amount of data, right? So like in this case, right, having access to just amenities data set is really hard for the local planner. And so then using these tools, I mean, you can get actually this residential points of interest. You can get these amenities. You can really start making decisions about the community. So I think where it would be more useful is in places where it's hard to access information. I was actually just in some Eastern European countries that seemed interested in that as well. So hopefully we can replicate the process in other places. I would like that.
All right, if there's no more questions, let's thank Professor Williams one more time for an excellent presentation. And next, we would like to invite you and other panelists to come up, and we start the mini panel right away.
No. Hi, I'm Jim Pick from the University of Redlands, and I'm the chair of this session. And I'd like just briefly to introduce the panelists. Already Sarah has been introduced, so I don't think I need to introduce her. Wai-Yi Wu is professor and vice director at Wuhan University, and has done a lot of work on WebGIS, high-performance computing, geospatial information, and many other things. I hesitate because there's so much with Keith Clark. I don't think I can cover it all, but I think you all are aware Keith Clark, the distinguished professor at UC Santa Barbara, And I also want to introduce Cleo Andrus from Penn State. Cleo has worked on social flows, social networks in geographic space, interpersonal relationships, urban planning, and the role of institutions in geography, among other things. I think that what we'll be doing is asking each panelist to give maybe roughly a 5-minute introduction. I think we'll start at the far end, and we'll give Sarah a little bit of a break. So we'll start at the far end with Cleo.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me here today. My name is Cleo Andrus. I received my PhD from MIT in 2011, and I was a member of the Sensible City Lab there. I was a postdoc at the Santa Fe Institute working with Louise Bettencourt and Jeffrey West, studying scaling laws and complex systems. And I also was a visiting researcher at Los Alamos National Labs in the Center for Nonlinear Studies. I am now an assistant professor at Penn State in the Department of Geography, and I'm the director of the Friendly Cities Lab. And we've had 14 or 15 researchers come through Friendly Cities at this point. Our goals with the Friendly Cities Lab is to study how to embed social flow data into GI systems. So that includes telecommunications, it includes any kind of movement data, it includes things like, texts, SMSs, and it also includes social capital data. So where we know people, where our social support is, where you have your parents, where you've gone on vacation, etc. So we make a wide web of interpersonal interactions that creates a spatial network. And my background is was dealing with big data for a long time, and we want to sort of look underneath of the big data and say, how are the people in our lives, how are our interpersonal relationships affecting what we do? How does our hometown still factor into our behavior? What kinds of neighborhoods have local social support? What kinds of neighborhoods have very distant social support? How are gentrifying areas connected to gentrifying areas in other cities so they make a whole network and not connected to the neighborhoods next door? How are small world networks being created in geographic space and not just in aspatial networks? And how can we plan for better cities in terms of making romantic relationships better, making parent-children relationships better, making our relationships, our professional relationships, our friendships better, especially now that so many things are going virtual? How do we save types of places and institutions to help support interpersonal relationships? So thank you.
Thanks, Cleo. I'm learning about you too. That's great. My name's Keith Clark. I've been studying in geography primarily, but my field is really cartography for a very long time. And I've always been interested in this relationship between scale and space and time and the relations that we study within geography that come out of this. I think what we're seeing here is really the merging of multiple areas or different parts of my career coming together at once. And the first is this idea of user-contributed information, the fact that everybody's a data source now. And we've gone from the scarcity of data that I started my career with, 39 observations, to 39 million observations, which obviously has very different implications as far as methods are concerned. I think the other dimension, part of my career is in visualization, which I consider part of cartography, but others don't. And we're seeing this blending, I think, particularly in Sarah's work here, of big data, social media, and citizen-sourced data becoming so overwhelmingly complex that its structure and meaning can only be discovered through visualization methods rather than the more purely analytical scientific methods that we applied in the past. I think as an exemplar, I'd hold up James Cheshire's book that came out a few years ago called The Information Capital, which is in many respects a very traditional coffee table type book, but it set forward very modern, very contemporary information about the City of London in a very innovative way. And how many geography books sold 60,000 copies in their first release? I think this is really very much a new angle into looking at these kinds of problems. So my interests within the urban realm are in urban dynamics, quite obviously. I spent much of my career looking at the land use changes that are propagated as a consequence of the conversion to urban land, both in terms of its initial conversion to an impermeable surface, but also in terms of the intensification and the reuse of that land, and therefore the reinvention of the structure of the city within it. I don't think I quite anticipated how much urbanization would happen within my career. I think we're seeing a faster rate of urbanization worldwide now than at any time in the history of the planet. And probably my daughters and granddaughters will never see as fast a rate of urbanization as we see today. And that's not just in China and in Europe. It's also in India and Philippines and Indonesia and wherever you care to look in the urbanizing planet. So I see these problems as essential, exactly figuring out the kinds of things we used to have to derive from the census from these new sources of information is critical, because it determines how we relate to the environment in which we live. And nothing is more important, both in terms of our lives, but also in terms of how efficiently we live those lives, and we certainly need to live those lives more efficiently. That's all I have to say right now.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I come from Wuhan University. Wuhan University actually is more work on technology part, not like a social or science part. So our work focuses on the technology, on how to integrate all kinds of data for decision making, including the 20% of the data, because Sarah said 80% of the data is not in government. So we did a lot of work on how to make use of the government-owned data, plus social network data, to improve the decision making of the government. So I'd like to connect to the project to show. Okay. As indicated by Professor Sarah, 80% of the data is not in this screen. But of course, even the 20% of data are not in this screen. We use the technology to integrate all of the kinds of data from the government to support better decision making for the government in a city. This actually is a demo developed by our Wuhan University and cooperated with other companies like GSAPP and Huawei. This demo shows that geospatial data, including spatial geospatial data, can be integrated under the government. For example, background is a map. We have integrated the data, real-time data of urban management, including all kinds of cases like unclean building exterior. We include data of public securities, urban environmental protection data, urban transportation data. I don't have enough. Yeah, it. And also other kind of data.
So I can record in the video.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. So, yeah, let me come here. Yeah. So all kinds of data from the government we can be integrated for the management of the government. So by this way, we can make use or take advantage of big geospatial data for the management. And this data can also be for the purpose of emergency response. For example, here is a case. Here is a fire, and we can directly know where the fire is. And we can use also the 2D map and 3D map. And when we know the building, we can directly know the building, how many people should be taken care of. For example, old or disabled people, says children and older people need to pay special care. And we also integrated data like gas, water, electricity, traffic, so that the government, the response sectors of government can intuitively to operate on this integrated operational center to manage, to respond the emergency. And then there's also other information like, not easy to see. Fire stations provided in this area, you can directly see, oh, here's a fire station, should be another fire station. And the best road from the fire station to the building. And also there's information about low enforced resources. For example, the information about areas or people that need special care, and other information about his department. Okay, our medical resources for the response, and of course there are a lot of information included. So this my demo shows that geospatial big data, especially spatial temporal real-time data, can help to support the urban management and also quick response. This is a demo, but the system has already deployed in some of the Chinese cities to help the government to help manage the city. And we are now trying to use the governmental data plus social network data. Yeah, for example, use Chinese tweet, Weibo, or Weixin data, WeChat data, to know, okay, where there are lots of people. So whenever there is an emergency there, we should have more police to there. So combined with the governmental data and another 80% of data, we can have more, we can have a better decision for urban management. So from this demo, actually I have some like messages. So where is the data? Okay, Sarah gave us a very good conclusion. Because government has data, that outside the government there are also a lot of data. And can we integrate all this data for decision making? Yes, if the government can coordinate all these departments to do this. And how far we can go? Yeah, actually, based on our experience, we can do a lot of based on geospatial data. For example, right now we only do the visualization, statistics, but if we combine with the social network data, we can actually do more research to use like artificial intelligence or deep learning to predict or forecast the health situations or the crimes like that. So I think we can go very far. There are lots of potential. We can work on this area. Yeah.
Some really interesting group of people at the table. I'm really excited to be here and be able to talk with you all. And so since we've already seen some of my work, I don't think I'll go on too long, but I think that's something that's really interesting about what we all just said is, you know, how can we communicate some of this big data analytics? And like here, your example is, you know, you have big data from the government. You're like, one way is to create this dashboard, which is kind of one of the projects that I had. But what are other ways that we can communicate these big data sets is, I think, really a critical issue right now to create policy change. And I feel like that would be an interesting thing to explore more. And I don't know if you had a set of questions that you wanted to throw out to us. I didn't want to take it over, but I did just speak, so I don't know if you need an introduction to myself, but I'll let you.
You can speak as long as you want, but I know the audience wants to pitch in here too. Cool. Is that okay? Or?
Yeah, that's great.
So many interesting topics covered. It's just too long a list to go into all of them. Urban topics, important topics, and I think what we want to do now is open the panel up to audience questions and discussion.
Thank you for the Professor Williams' talk and also for the panelists, I think, the talks. I think now, I mean, with the geospatial data and open data, I think, become more and more available. One issue, I think, in the urban planning, I think, is like how we use this kind of data in the futures, right, to planning of cities. And I know in Canada they have some trend. Seems like in the past, our urbanization will always go to have a big suburb, right? And now you see the trend that people seems to get more and more close, centralized in the urban downtown areas. And so they have a planning trend. Seems they want more kind of focused, the city planning. And where this kind of the geospatial data will help us direct, in the future, how we better planning, or determine whether we should go for more kind of disturbed city planning or go to more centralized city plannings.
Oh, I can speak to that one. Yeah, I'm very excited about the movement that's bringing more people back downtown and increasing housing densities, and more important, reusing existing buildings rather than building from scratch. I'd like to throw it 100 years into the future. Within the next 100 years, I hope, we'll meet our peak population as a species, and then we'll start to drop in population. So the question might be, if 150 years out, how are we going to get rid of surface cover? Which cities are we going to choose to lose, or which are we going to adjust so that they're perhaps more suited to the society 150 years from now? I think these will be really challenging problems. One of the most alarming aspects of urbanization has been the consumption of agricultural land, taking it out of food production, which is it's some of the most productive land there is, usually, that we lose. But then also we cover the surface with impermeable cover, which increases runoff, it increases dangers of flooding, it throws pollutants into the drainage systems. There are a lot of disadvantages to the way that we currently do urbanization. So I'm pretty excited about the application of all these new sources of information to planning and designing cities. And as I said, I hope they better inform a new planning of the future.
Yeah, I want to add something to this. I'm also excited about the possibility, but I also think we need data literate planners, and I think that's one of the things I didn't highlight completely in my talk, but why I make tools for data literacy for youth. I think we have a lot of potential to make really interesting analysis, policy, but our planners haven't always been trained in how to do these kinds of analytics, and I think it needs to be more incorporated in government, more systematic, and I think it has been in the last few years, and I think that's something, as many of us are academics in the room, is really we need to think about how to help government think about these new processes, because they are becoming interested in it, but they're highly dependent on Cisco's and IBM's. How can we make planners that are trained in doing this data analytics themselves?
Let me just add something to that from my own experience, and that is that the sorts of graphics and visual analytics that appeal to the general public often don't work for elected officials or council members or the people that the actual decisions have to be made by. So I haven't seen a lot yet of adaptation of visual analytics to audience. And certainly I think there's a lot more that can be done theoretically around how to do that better.
Are there some more questions?
I can respond to that as well, if that's okay. I think that academics are really focused, and especially our students, our graduate students, are very focused on methods. I think that their methods, they want that to be the core of the paper, because they think that, oh, then everyone's going to use my method, and then I'll be very famous, and people will cite my paper very often. And the case study that they apply it to seems to be very trivial. It gets pushed away. I asked them, do you know what city you did this modularity algorithm on? Do you know why you got the results? Do you know what kinds of landmarks are there? Do you know who lives there? Do you know what the population of this city is? They said, no, we ran the algorithm, it's faster now. That's not necessarily a research question that's gonna help people. And I would be interested in hearing people's how to fix that. I've noticed that one thing that helps engage the researchers a little bit more into application, which seems such a dirty word to them, is to have them have a hypothesis. So instead of a hypothesis being, I think that my algorithm's going to run faster, we ask them, what do you think that you're going to find in this city? Do you think that if you divide the city into two parts based on the phone calls, that part is going to be divided by a highway? Do you think it's going to separate racial groups? Do you think that the river is going to be a big factor in this? And it allows them to actually engage with the area. And then planners and urbanists can come and take that answer, and then they can apply it a little bit better.
That sounds a lot like science.
Or geography.
So to turn us around a little bit, been talking a lot about being able to collect data and collect it together and allow people to make data-driven decisions, but that's also kind of a hub and spoke view, and there's an alternative view that some people have been in favor of, that being able to collect data generally, to have crowdsourced or sensed, decentralized data collection, the availability of mobile phone apps, and the analytical ability to bring that to conclusions that then individual people can look up. That there can be actually more of a self-service government, that it maybe brings you in the direction of not needing so much centralization, but individual people being able to contribute the information and then act, you know, individually or in smaller collections on the results. Is that, you think, feasible, possible, inevitable?
So say that again.
You mean we can do bottom-up government? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Well, we've certainly moved in that direction in the last couple of decades, you know, with taking different interested groups into account, making things more objective, having more open hearings, being more inclined to gather data and to expose that data to the public with hearings before making a major decision. So in a way, yeah, that supports bottom-up, but don't we elect our supervisors and decision makers? That's public participation.
But the more that they're driven by the data that are provided by the citizens, they become more of an intermediary rather than a director.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question and something I've thought about. Read an article about is kind of, if we go back to planners, Arnstein's ladder of the haves and the have-nots, right? And that the planner is meant to kind of bridge that knowledge gap between those people who have information and those people who have not. And how can we do that now in a data-driven society? And one assumption is that, you know, that the local citizens can also bring data to bear and educate the haves, right? And I think it's an interesting question because I think in my research of like citizen-generated data, really the benefit of those are more education than accuracy, right? And that the citizens become educated in the data that they're collecting and bringing to bear to the government. But I think that the power structure remains, so you might be able to close the gap, and those that have not are able to educate those that have. And I think that it's one of the many tools that we have in our arsenal of really educating people about the policy changes that we need to make in our communities, right? And so to create great change as an urban planner, you want all of the stakeholders to be educated, and that's one way to do it. Visualization of data sets, you know, a map, a simple map is also a way that the haves can educate the have-nots, but we have to be data literate. Again, this is my data literacy on it. How can the have-nots be literate in reading that data set? So, and they can become literate in reading that data set by collecting their own data and understanding what it means. So it's just an interesting, I think, you know, the range of possibilities still exists along Arnstein's ladder, and that ladder shifts over time.
May I?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I think this question has two aspects. So data accuracy is very important for like decision making, or I don't know, because I'm not a urban planning planner. For daily operation of a city, like urban emergency response, you should have very accurate data to support. So from this point of view, the governmental data is very good. But from the other aspects, the social network or citizen data are very good for large scale study, research, and for the purpose of, I think, I don't know, for planning. Yeah. But for daily operation of the city, I think they need very accurate data to support their decision. So like which gate to enter and which floor is getting fired or whatever. Yeah.
Well, is there a last question? Okay, last question. Go ahead.
I'll make it quick. As I'm listening to this this panel, I'm reminded of a talk I saw a couple years ago maybe it was 3 years ago, on something called Pulse Labs out of United Nations. Does that sound familiar to anybody?
Yes, I know.
Oh, good, great. So my understanding of it, and I don't know whether it's still active and going, but the idea is that that there are these public archives developed of streaming data of various types, and some of it's contributed by private companies that are not so anonymized. Cell phone data is one source, and you know, so in some parts of the world, you know, cell phone purchases can be an indicator of ability, you know, spending resources, and there are a whole bunch of data streams that can be very useful for governments that don't have the resources to do regular census. And in a way, it's in some ways replacing some of the census kind of mechanisms. But so when we're talking about data literacy, and there are all these pieces to that, right? I mean, even here, we've got planners. A lot of planners don't know how to think about data, right? But not only that, they don't even have access to the data, right? I mean, even say something like tweets, right? There's not really a good central place where you could just go and grab tweets. I mean, you can go and grab them from the API, but there's not an archive of them. There's not an archive of anonymized cell phone data. There's not at least that I know about. Maybe you do. But I'm thinking about a platform, right? So here are 5 or 6 bins of reliable data that's been sanctioned by MIT or maybe the US government or maybe, you know, some good housekeeping seal of approval. Here are best practices for using that, implemented in algorithms on GitHub. You know, anybody can also build and improve them. You know, and here are training materials for getting planners to basically use these basic algorithms or techniques to start to play with this data that's here and available. I mean, how do we? I guess I'm just brainstorming about a foundation for that could be broad, right, for moving this stuff forward.
Do we have any foundations in the room? I'd love that. Go ahead.
Well, I can speak to at least one project at the University of Kentucky, the DALI project, which archives Twitter data over long periods and then responds to queries for particular keyword searches. I've made quite a lot, or at least my students have made quite a lot of use of it. It's very advantageous because if you want a particular national disaster, for example, and it's happened more than 2 weeks ago, it's not, you know, you can't access it from the Twitter API. Yeah, what you're doing, I think, is, or what you're suggesting is very valuable. No.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting question. I mean, because there is the DALI project. There's been the Pulse project did try, and it wasn't really successful in getting, because it was based on the idea that companies would contribute their data sets to these, and they just couldn't get people to do that because they couldn't provide the proper business motivation to do it. And I think that's something that's really important because, you know, we have Uber now, we have Google, we have Taxi Pixie, we have like all these different kinds of groups that are collecting data sets. How do we get them to share it? And I think that cities are really being challenged in that way. In fact, the data that I put into Google Maps for Nairobi, I was just on the phone with them on Friday. And all I want to know is how many times have somebody queried on our data, right? Like, have you queried on it? And I mean, it would be amazing to then understand the value of having that data on Google. We negotiated that when we agreed to have the data in Google Maps, and then they can't provide it to us because they can't create a business use for it. So I think like, how do we get access to this private data is one of the biggest issues we face as we come on to urban planners.
Yeah, so that leads to a bigger question, or maybe a small question with a huge answer, which is, are there certain data utilities? Does it get to the point where we're so dependent, we need these data streams so badly, regardless of the commercial business case that, I mean, this has been asked about Twitter. You know, should Twitter become a, you know, global public utility?
Beyond the intelligence agencies, you mean?
Good point, Keith. They're doing it. We just.
Well, I think some of the conversation's going to have to continue because I'm getting a signal that, you know, it's time to finish up. I just wanted to make one note. I did have prepared questions. I'm not going to ask them. All of them have been answered, and one of my questions was, how may these new tools, spatial temporal tools, change urbanism as a way of life in cities? And I think that's been answered many ways by the panel discussion of the panel on civil and urban dynamics. And I think we want to thank Sarah, Wai, Keith, and Cleo for this wonderful panel.
Didn't know you were the same thing.
2 years.
Very nice.
So next is a coffee break, and then quickly operate a shortened coffee break, and then breakout sessions.
My MIT is on.